All right, everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started with our Nature 101 program. This month, we are focusing on watersheds. So every month, the Zionsville Nature Center puts on one of these Nature 101 programs. Sometimes they're in person, sometimes they are virtual, sometimes it's actually a mix of both, where we have a virtual one-time program and then a field day to follow, which is what next month September's program is going to be. It's all about trees. But here tonight, we're here to talk about watersheds. So my name is Rachel Felling. I'm a naturalist at the Zionsville Parks and Recreation Department, and I love to talk about watersheds. It's such a fun topic. It's one of those things that here in Indiana, we may not think about all that often, being in a landlocked state, but it's actually super important, and that's what we're going to get into tonight. So whether you are watching through the Zoom program, or you're live streaming on Facebook, or you happen to catch this later on Facebook or via our YouTube channel, I hope you find some really interesting info. And if you have questions about anything we talk about, put them in the comments of either the chat on Zoom or the Facebook comments, and I will do my best to get to the answers to all of them, because I would love to help answer any unanswered questions that come up tonight. So with that, I'm actually going to do a screen share for most of the program. I've got a PowerPoint that's got some really cool images and pictures that we're going to talk about here. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about watersheds. So I think the most important thing to start with here is, what is a watershed? So we'll just start with the definition from the U.S. Geological Survey, which their job, they do a lot of different things, but one of the things that they do is take a look at hydrology in the United States, so managing rivers, watersheds, things like that. As far as federal agencies go, the USGS is kind of the big one there. Their definition of what a watershed is: an area of land that drains all of the streams and rainfall to a common outlet, such as the outflow of a reservoir, mouth of a bay, or any point along a stream or channel. So that's the technical definition. Let's break that down a little bit. What do we mean when we say watershed? So I love this image because it shows it really well. We're talking about the area of land where all of the water flows to the same place. So depending on where you are, that place might be different things, but it's typically the main body of water in an area. So in this picture, you've got a river down the middle to a water body. That water body could be a lake, it could be the ocean, it could be a bay, it could be a gulf, just kind of depends on where your setting is. That water body could also just be a larger river, depending on which watershed you're talking about, okay? And then you see these little sort of side streams coming in, or even a pond sometimes, or a small lake. We call those tributaries. They contribute into that main body of water. And then what happens is we have precipitation, we have rain, usually is where water comes from, right? And water uses gravity just like everything else on Earth and flows to the lowest point. Okay, now some of that water is going to get soaked down into the ground, and we see that represented in this image as groundwater. And here in Indiana, we do have plenty of groundwater. Other parts of the world and country, that's not the same thing. But here we do, there's a fair amount that goes down into the groundwater in our water table. But also a lot of it flows off of the land and eventually into the creeks. So imagine maybe in your neighborhood, you have a small stream that runs through the back of some of the areas, right? So it rains and that water collects and runs into that little creek. And then that little creek is eventually going to run into maybe a larger creek somewhere else in your town. And then that larger creek will eventually flow to maybe a river or something else of that nature. And there's all sorts of other pieces of this that we're going to get into, but it's important to recognize that the boundaries of a watershed, okay, and we'll define this more shortly. The boundaries of the watershed are dependent upon the hydrology of the area. So that means, what is the topography? How does the land, is it shaped, right? If you picture a mountain, it's easy to imagine the water flowing down a mountain and finding the streams and rivers. In places like central Indiana, where it's largely flat, It's harder to imagine that, but even when it feels flat, there is topography. We do flow into lower places. And then in our more suburban and urban areas where we have lots of housing developments, you think of when you walk down the street, you see storm drains, okay? So I think there are some people that have a misconception that that storm drain, that water that flows through there is going to end up going to a water treatment plant the same way that the water that goes down the drain in your house does. And that's usually not the case. Usually those storm drains, excuse me, are there as flood prevention to help collect the rainwater that falls down in your suburban or urban area and direct it into the creeks or other bodies of water in the area, sometimes directly into like a retention pond. If you live in a subdivision, that's often why those are put in as water catchment to kind of control the flow of water, okay? And then all of that's eventually going to end up in, you know, your water body, okay? So I hope that makes sense. The interesting thing about water is that it is largely just recycled throughout the earth and has been for the entire existence of Earth. Okay, the amount of water that is on Earth is generally been consistent for literally millions of years, which I think is really interesting to think about. As I love talking about this with kids, but like the water that we have on the planet today is the same water that the dinosaurs have. Now, does that always mean it's in a usable form for us as humans? No, sometimes it gets locked up in glaciers. Sometimes it ends up in the ocean and it becomes, you know, it gains salinity because it becomes salt water. And, you know, going back to your basics of elementary school, the water cycle, the water evaporates and then condenses, and then we get precipitation and the water cycle continues on. So the water moves around and ends up in different places, but it is generally the same amount of water on Earth and always has been. All right, so let's talk about, now that we have a good definition of what a watershed is, how is this applicable in the rest of the world? So how are watersheds applicable in the rest of the world? Let's keep taking a look. We have our water, this image is water resource regions, okay? And what that basically means is large scale watersheds throughout the United States. You could look at this through the entire world, and you'd see other ones too, but we'll focus on the US today because that's where we are. So watersheds are defined generally by the large bodies of water that they flow into. So we're here in Indiana. You can see Indiana in this mostly dark pink color for the Ohio River. So most of the water that's flowing through our streams, rivers, whether it's a tiny little backyard creek or the White River, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the Wabash River, the St. Joe River, the Eel River, Big Walnut Creek, all these larger bodies of water, these larger rivers are all eventually going to flow to the Ohio River. I shouldn't have said St. Joe County or the St. Joe River because that one actually goes somewhere else. And that is all dependent on the topography of the area. So everything's going to flow to the Ohio River, which makes that southern border of Indiana in that picture. And the Ohio eventually leads to the Mississippi. And the Mississippi, which we see the lower Mississippi area here in this light blue color, eventually dumps out here into the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so different rivers empty into different places because of the topography of the land. Something that's kind of interesting up here, if you go into northern Indiana, I'm from South Bend originally, and up near the South Bend area, you pass a sign for the Continental Divide, the North-South Continental Divide. And what that means is the topography of the land changes from the south part of the continent to the north part of the continent. So the rivers up in northern Indiana, this little slice up here, flow actually into the Great Lakes. So they don't flow south towards the Mississippi, they flow up into the Great Lakes, which I think is really interesting. And then the Great Lakes do eventually open up into the North Atlantic, way up here through like the Hudson Bay, but we don't obviously have all of Canada on this map. So really just kind of interesting. Watersheds are defined in lots of different ways. And I read this really interesting thing the other day when I was doing some research on watersheds that I just, it's a little tidbit that I thought some of y'all might find interesting. But here in the corner of Wyoming and a little bit into Montana and Idaho is Yellowstone National Park, a place that many of us have probably visited. And if you haven't visited, it's probably on a bucket list. It's such an incredible place. I've only been there once and I would love to go again. And it was actually from the US Geological Survey that posted this. They were talking about the Yellowstone watersheds. And the Yellowstone National Park splits their watershed. A lot of the water from Yellowstone, think of the geysers in Yellowstone. The water from those geysers goes up through some rivers that eventually end up in the Missouri River, which is the longest river in the United States, which then dumps eventually into the Mississippi right outside of St. Louis. So, and then on into the Gulf of Mexico, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. But some of the water in Yellowstone National Park that's on sort of the southwest corner, instead of ending up all the way out into the Atlantic Ocean, flows west and hits the Columbia River, which exits into the Pacific Ocean right here between Oregon and Washington, which I just found really fascinating, right? Like this cool, unique geological area in Yellowstone National Park. You've got also the dividing line of these watersheds that go all the way to one ocean from another. So just a cool, interesting thing to kind of geek out about. But the Rocky Mountains are a huge dividing line right through here, right? They're going to divide what goes east and what goes west generally. So again, topography matters. So, you know, I have always loved watersheds. I've loved learning about it. And it's because of where I learned environmental education and where I came up from. So I started my career working in Acadia National Park in Maine, obviously right on the coast, then in Baltimore, Maryland, right near the Chesapeake Bay, and then some years in Hawaii on Oahu, obviously on the Pacific Ocean. So in those places, I was constantly teaching watershed health, watershed health, watershed health. And then I moved to Indiana, landlocked state, and spent one of my first summers here focusing on teaching watershed health to kids. And it's one of those things that I actually think is more interesting to teach here because so many people don't know about it. But even if you aren't on an ocean, your watershed is still so important. Now, we're not relying on it directly for food as much as people in, say, the Chesapeake Bay or coastal Maine are, but the health of our watershed is incredibly important, and we're going to get into why in just a second. So what is our watershed? So when we scale it way down here in Zionsville, and you may be watching from somewhere else in the Indianapolis area, but for those of you who live in Zionsville, our watershed is the Eagle Creek watershed. That is our small general watershed. And you can see on this image, we can get into some sub watersheds even beyond that. Right here, Zionsville's right here, kind of at the pocket of several sub watersheds. Eagle Creek flows right through the heart of Zionsville. So we have several of those tributaries. Remember, we said a tributary was a body of water, usually a creek, a stream, another small river that contributes to that body of water that we're talking about. So we've got Fishback Creek, Jackson Run, and Little Eagle Creek all kind of coming together to flow into Eagle Creek. And those of you who are in the Indy area know that then Eagle Creek goes down over into Indianapolis and forms Eagle Creek Reservoir was a man-made structure. And if you are on city water in Indianapolis, in Zionsville, your drinking water is coming from Eagle Creek Reservoir, okay? So that is our sort of mini watershed. That means all of those creeks, whether it's your tiny little backyard creek or you're looking at big section of Eagle Creek, they all flow there eventually. And then Eagle Creek is part of what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, which is the Upper White River watershed. Okay, so the Upper White River watershed is really interesting. The White River is the large river that flows through the city of Indianapolis. And, you know, if you've crossed the Monon and Broad Ripple, you've been on the White River. The canal is part of the White River. It was created, right, adjacent to the White River. The White River flows right through, I believe it's 10th Street, through the middle of downtown, right by the zoo, near the Indian Stadium. So it's a big body of water. Now there is an east fork of the White River does come down and connect to where we are eventually. But the White River has some humble beginnings out here in Randolph County, actually starts near a ditch and some farm fields through a spring. And then it eventually flows all the way through here. And then we get into all these areas up near Muncie, Anderson, and then down here through Hamilton County, Marion County, and then down this way. Okay, oop, let's go back a second. So the Upper White River watershed houses about 30% of the population of the state of Indiana. So that's a lot of people. And remember, when we're talking about a watershed, it's not just the river, it's not just the body of water, it's all of the land. So we think about these 16 counties that this touches, that the Upper White River watershed touches. 30% of the state of Indiana's population. That means everybody's backyard, their street, when it rains, all of that water, minus what soaks into the ground in the groundwater, all of that surface water that flows off eventually ends up in the White River. So that's quite a bit. And that also means, and we'll get into this more in a little bit, that anything else that runs off or washes off with those rains also ends up in the White River eventually. So earlier this morning here in the Indianapolis area, we had some pretty heavy thunderstorms, a good amount of rain. I didn't check how much we got, but it poured pretty hard for a little while. We needed it. It had not rained much for quite some time. All of that water eventually flows to the White River. All right, so let's talk about this a little bit more. And then the White River, just to zoom back out a little bit, eventually hits the Wabash River down here just north of like Evansville. I believe this is, I want to say New Albany, but that's not right. New Albany is a different spot. It hits the Wabash River right here. The Wabash River makes a lot of the western border of Indianapolis, the western border basically south of Terre Haute, and then flows down all the way to Evansville, where the Wabash then meets the Ohio River. The Ohio River makes the southern boundary of Indiana, and then the Ohio River eventually hits the Mississippi out near the Illinois western border. So that's really interesting. All of this water eventually goes to the Mississippi and then out to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so let's keep talking about why this is important. But to talk about why that's important, we need to establish, how do we use this water? How do we use the river? Okay, whether it's Eagle Creek directly or the Upper White River or just the White River, how do we use the water? And, you know, one of the big things we often think about is recreation, right? Do you get out and boat? Do you swim? I know I do. Not everybody does, but some people are out on rivers and boats. Some are out, you know, creek stomping through a creek or swimming. Now, in many parts of the White River, that's not exactly the most advisable. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But it would be nice to. But the big thing, the main big one for us is our drinking water. The White River provides drinking water for so many people. So now we don't turn on a faucet in our kitchens and that comes directly from the White River. You know, it goes through water treatment facilities before it ends up in our glasses and in our cups. But how much work that water treatment facility has to do to clean the water before it comes to us is important. It's, as you might imagine, not the easiest thing to clean water once it's really dirty. All right. And then finally, how we use the water, fishing, right? Food. Fish are a huge food source for the humans, really nutritional and important for a lot of people. But unfortunately, in many parts of the White River, fishing is not advised. So it would be nice if we could use the water more for a food source, but right now that's not so much of an option. All right, and then very important, you know, the rivers aren't just for us. They provide habitat for tons of plants and animals, lots of different things. We've got a great blue heron here, a smallmouth bass, green frog, painted turtle, an otter. We have river otters here in Indiana, which a lot of people don't even know. But this is home for many of these creatures. So really, really important that we keep it nice and healthy for them as well. That, again, surprise, doesn't always happen. All right, so let's talk about those concerns. What kinds of concerns do we have with the watershed? So, oh, what a terrible image, right? Got some nasty sludge going directly into the water. So when you have pollution going directly into a body of water, we call that source point pollution. Now, the Clean Water Act was established in the 1970s, and part of what the Clean Water Act did was federally mandate how and when, or if at all, this kind of action can be taken, whether or not companies, manufacturers, and industry and all can directly dump into rivers. And prior to that, it was basically a free-for-all, right? If a factory was producing whatever they're producing and they have some sort of byproduct they needed to get rid of, there was very little regulation in most places from preventing them from dumping it directly in rivers. The Clean Water Act was a big turning point for stopping that. Prior to that, I mean, rivers in a lot of places were completely dead, not a lot of things living in them. There's stories of Lake Erie outside of Cleveland being set on fire because it was so full of pollution that, you know, those flammable chemicals actually set on fire. We've come a long way. It's a lot better. Fortunately, because of regulation like that, source point pollution does not happen very often without people getting into trouble. I shouldn't say that it doesn't happen, because it does, but usually people or companies, businesses, whoever's doing it, end up getting in trouble for it. It still does happen. And there are some areas where things are discharged into the water, but there's regulation about how it has to be cleaned first and how much can go in, and it has to be monitored. And that's thanks to regulations from the EPA to keep the water clean. So one big source point pollution incident that happened locally in the White River was in the year 1999. A auto parts manufacturer in Anderson dumped a bunch of chemical byproduct directly into the White River, and it caused a massive fish kill throughout the entire river, all the way down into Broad Ripple. They were seeing this in downtown Indianapolis. So just because something happens in one place, because of the way that the water flows, it can affect so many things downstream. Like, we use the phrase downstream when we talk about the effects things have. This is literally where it comes from. The stuff flows downstream and can have pretty adverse effect. All right, so source point pollution is an issue, but it's not the biggest issue that we face nowadays. Much of the source point pollution has been pretty well regulated. Some of those regulations are often in danger of being changed or modified to be more business friendly, but less environmentally friendly, but it's still an issue. What is really important right now, where we're seeing more of our issues for watershed health come from two things: runoff and erosion, which we call non-source point pollution, right? We're not putting stuff intentionally directly into the water, but what happens is things run off of the land and go into the water. Now, that can be chemicals, right? Like, think of, let's say you've got a car that is leaking oil sitting on a street, and then it rains. The oil that is sitting under the car then pulls off and then flows down into those storm drains, dumps into the creek and down on into the river. That is what we call runoff, right? It's a non-source point pollution. Somebody didn't go pour the oil directly into the river, but the oil still made its way into the river. This is the same thing when we talk about like litter, when we've got just trash out, you know, on a city street or tossed out of a window down a county road. It eventually, when it rains, will get caught, and much of it ends up in the water, and it keeps flowing downstream, right? So And this is also true for agricultural pollution, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into some of the specific issues plaguing our watershed, the White River watershed here in central Indiana. So, and then finally, flow obstruction can be a huge concern in your watershed, meaning maybe dams have been put up, maybe creeks and rivers have been rerouted for development. That can cause huge problems downstream, can lead to flooding in some places, can lead to drought in other places. This is not as big of an issue in our part of the country as it is out west, where it's more dry and where, damming up a river in one place can have massive effects in another. When you rely on that rain or snow melt in other places, it's not as much of an issue here, and we don't see it as often here, but it can be a big issue in other places. And lots and lots and lots of rivers have been dammed up across the United States. Some of that is hugely beneficial for us to have clean drinking water. Some of it, in other places, though, the environmental effects are becoming more obvious the longer these dams have been in place. So flow obstruction is another huge issue to talk about, but not as much here, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on it. So let's talk about Eagle Creek and the White River, because that's where we live, and those are our main concerns. What sorts of things are going on in these areas? What do we need to know about? And then don't worry, we will talk about solutions. I'm not just going to come here and dump like all the terrible and not talk about solutions, but let's talk about the problems first. So agricultural runoff, okay? Agricultural runoff can mean lots of things, but it's a lot of that non-source point pollution that is a big problem for the Eagle Creek area and the White River watersheds. So the Eagle Creek watershed is about 162 square miles. Most of that is agricultural land. The White River is largely agricultural land with the exception of urban Indianapolis, right? The White River watershed. You drive much out of Indianapolis and you end up in cornfields. That's just how it is around here. So a lot of this agricultural runoff dumps what we call nutrients, okay? So we've got problems with nutrients, pesticides, and animal waste. We'll talk about animal waste second because it's a little different than like our corn and soybean fields that we're going to see. But what happens is, as farmers are growing their crops, they very necessarily need to add some pesticides sometimes or herbicides to help keep things healthy. Some of that, especially if it's not applied at the right timing, you apply it and then it rains, which obviously is generally not how farmers do it because they don't want to waste those chemicals that they need. It can run off, or if it's over applied, it runs off. And some of those things, even the fertilizers, even the things that seem like maybe they'd be good because they're full of nutrients, when they run off, again, they're going to find the little creeks and down eventually into the river. Okay, so some of that can have some really tough effects. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the big nutrients that come from agricultural runoff that cause a lot of issues. When we think nutrients, we often think it's a good thing, right? Well, plants, animals, we all need nutrients, right? Yes and no. Nutrients cause what we call algae blooms. So the algae, there's so much nutrients in the water that the algae grows and then it blocks out everything else. And so it causes basically dead zones in an area. This often happens in the oceans just outside of where rivers empty into the ocean, but it can happen in lakes, it can happen in rivers, it can happen in ponds. And you get these dead zones where nothing can live anymore because there's too much of the algae blooming and it takes up all of the resources. And that's a huge issue in the Gulf of Mexico. So of the water, remember we said the White River flows to the Wabash River, which then flows out, it hits, the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Gulf of Mexico. When we get down to the Gulf of Mexico, only about 1 to 7% of the water in the Gulf, exiting the Gulf, is from the Wabash River, right? So not proportionally a ton of the water that's exiting into the Gulf, but up to 17% of the nutrients that are exiting are coming from the Wabash River. So that means here in Indiana, we're responsible for a whole lot of those nutrients that end up down there. Okay, so, and we'll talk again when we get into talking about solutions. There are a lot of multi-agency efforts happening to try to change that and reduce those numbers so that you don't get these algae blooms that result in dead zones. The researchers who spend a lot of time monitoring the Gulf of Mexico's health, Gulf of Mexico is super important for food, for recreation, for habitat, for lots of things. They predict every year how big the dead zone will be where we exit. And this year they're saying it's a dead zone of about the size of New Jersey, which is really interesting. And it kind of changes depending on the year. So in addition to agricultural runoff from just fields, if we have large scale animal farms, which often we have a lot of beef farms, some pork, chicken is not as big of a problem. It's the larger animals that causes the issue. We get the runoff of the manure, right? So when you've got a field full of cows, well, the cows aren't all going and pooping in one designated spot that's then scooped up and disposed of in a certain way to keep it out of the water. What happens is it rains and that all runs off the fields and into the creeks. So the bacteria then can cause major issues in the water. It can be really detrimental to the health of the animals that live in the rivers and creeks. It can also be detrimental to humans. Okay, so that's a big issue, agricultural runoff. And here in the White River and Eagle Creek watersheds, that's one of our big concerns, but also that's not it, urbanization. Now, urbanization is not purely city, downtown Indianapolis, skyscrapers, big things like that. It can be suburban areas like here in Zionsville, okay? So when we talk about urbanization, we're basically talking about, it's not agricultural, it's not natural anymore, it's humans living there. So when urbanization happens, we have a lot of issues with runoff, we have a lot of issues with litter. Some of it is, like we talked about earlier, with got a car leaking oil or something else, flows off the land and ends up in the creeks. But it can also be that litter, things like that. It can also be some of us who are maybe well-intentioned, trying to make our yard really pretty. So you put a bunch of fertilizers out on your yard and then it rains and much of that runs off. It can be the gardener who's trying to get rid of the bugs in their garden, so they're spraying pesticides, or the well-intentioned homeowner who has mosquitoes and wants to get rid of them, so they spray the mosquitoes and kill all of the insects in the meantime. And then those chemicals run off. So even though we are smaller scale than the large farm fields that we see surrounding the Indianapolis area, as homeowners, as businesses, as anybody in these areas, we are contributing to the health of the watershed. Every single one of us has the power to positively or negatively impact the health of our rivers and creeks and streams. And again, it happens in lots and lots of different ways. All right, so talked about a lot of the bad stuff, a lot of like doom and gloom. Oh, creeks and rivers aren't doing so great. How can we help? And I will back up and say that in many areas in the Eagle Creek watershed, a lot of the creeks and streams around here in Indianapolis, they are fairly healthy. Okay, I've been out doing with kids, taking a look at what's in there, and we'll talk more about this in just a little bit. And there is a good amount of life. There are a lot of great bioindicators, meaning living things that are not pollution tolerant, that need clean water to live, that are thriving in Eagle Creek and its tributaries. But the White River is kind of a different story, okay? And a lot of people might see this and think, well, it's Indianapolis, it's the city, but it's not just that. I read about research done on White River sampling, and much of the pollution that's in the White River comes in north of Indianapolis from some of the agricultural areas and even some of the suburban areas. So, this is not just a city problem. It is city, it is agricultural, and it is suburban. It's all of us together, where every everything is tied together and affecting one another. So in the city of Indianapolis, they are currently working on the Big Dig Tunnel, which will help keep sewage overflows when it rains heavily from ending up in the river. That's awesome. That's going to hugely improve the White River. But we need to go further upstream as well. And we'll talk some more about that, some success stories in a moment. So, but how can you help? You know, I think a lot of times when we hear about environmental problems, it seems too big. It seems insurmountable as an individual to make a difference. So how can we as an individual help? Because you actually do have tons of power, okay? So there are a lot of really awesome ways. Litter and pollution prevention, okay? You can do cleanups, and we'll talk about cleanups. There's lots of cool ways that you can get involved, but prevention is the best thing you can do. It is so much easier to keep things out of the water than to try to remove it once they're in. Now, you know, if it's a soda bottle floating down, that's not the hardest thing to remove. Once it starts, things break down into smaller pieces, it can get harder. But when we talk about these chemicals, these things that I can't just scoop up with a net because they are connected now to the water, they're liquids that have mixed in these micro amounts that I can't see and remove physically, that's really, really hard to clean. It is economical for us to try to keep it out too, makes it easier for us to clean water for ourselves, and it keeps things healthier and happier for everybody. So trying to prevent it in the first place. As a homeowner, right? Trying to keep all your yard and areas clean, litter free. Really, really limit the ways in which you fertilize your yard and your garden. Do it with all natural things if you can, or in very small quantities, and definitely watch the weather and don't do it right before a rain. It makes me crazy when I see landscaping stuff out and people are spraying stuff on a day where it's going to rain, because that stuff gets washed off. All right. Other things you can do is conserving water, right? If we don't have to tax the system as much, it's easier for our utility companies to keep things clean and healthy for us. We're fortunate here in central Indiana to live in an area where we're not plagued with droughts like the West is. But that doesn't mean that our water is an unending source, right? It's going to get more expensive to clean if there's less of it. So conserving water is important. You know, maybe you put out a rain barrel at your house for watering your garden. There's lots of different things you can do. Cleaning up after your pets. This is a huge one that as an average person, really, really important. Working here in a parks department, goodness knows we find lots of dog poop along trails, but cleaning up along the trails and even in your own yard, making sure that that pet waste gets bagged up and is properly disposed of in the trash. Our waste disposal companies have to dispose of our waste in ways that don't affect the watershed, right? Because they need to keep the water healthy. Okay, so especially if you live near a creek or you're, you know, on a slope that's prone to a lot of drainage, cleaning up your pet waste is super duper important. Bag it up, throw it in your trash barrel to go out with your regular trash, or flush it if you can. I know that might seem weird to some people, like, I'm going to go flush my dog's poop. Yeah, in most places you can. Now, if you live on a septic, you should talk to a septic company first just to make sure your system can handle it, but very important. All right, especially in your parks. Please don't leave dog poop in the parks. That drives us park staff crazy. We don't want to have to clean it up. And if you bag it, take it out with you, please. All right, planting native plants, right? So this one might be kind of counterintuitive if you're not very familiar with this. Just because you plant native plants, what does that do to help watershed? Well, a lot of our plants are built to soak up water. Instead of having a yard that is just grass, nothing else, grass doesn't soak up a ton of water, but you can plant plants that are designed to do that. And that can be hugely beneficial to our watershed health as well. And in addition, it creates habitat for birds and insects and things that need habitat. All right, maintain your septic system. Now, some of you on the call or are watching on Facebook may not have a septic system, so maybe isn't important to you, but The EPA estimates that nearly 30% of the septic systems in the United States are failing in some way, especially if your septic was installed prior to the year 2000. Okay, so couple things to know. Get your septic system inspected every few years. They recommend every 3 to 5 years you pump it out, but inspections even sooner, especially if you're starting to have issues. If you smell anything, especially outside after a rain, if it smells kind of funky, get it inspected, okay? Failing septics leak the nasty stuff that goes into our septic tanks out into our water, ends up in the waterways, contributes to E. coli and other bacteria that contaminate the water. So really, 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 really important to keep and maintain your septic system. At the end, there's going to be some links. One of those has some awesome resources for what to look for, what to be thinking about. And, you know, if you've lived on a septic forever, you probably know a little bit more about maintaining it, but there's a lot to it. We bought a house with a septic a few years ago and I had never had one. I had no idea. But it's really, really important that you maintain your septic, you know, especially if we're thinking like, man, 30% of those are failing. Buy local meat, local produce helps to not tax the transportation system that creates more pollution to get things here. If you're buying local meat, you're less likely to be supporting large-scale factory farms where there might be tons of animal waste getting washed off the land. And less pesticides and herbicides used on the produce that's grown if it's grown locally. That's one simple thing you can do. You have power in the where you spend your money. Talk to your HOA if you're in an HOA. I know a lot of the people in Zionsville live in suburban neighborhoods. Talk to your HOA about how you can make the area healthier, right? We talked about those native plants. Well, if we can plant more native plants that soak up water better, then we're going to have less runoff going down our storm drains and then on into the creeks and rivers. A lot of those plants act almost as a filter as well. They clean the water as they go through. Think about the retention ponds in most subdivisions. You just have grass surrounding them and nothing else. See if you can talk to your HOA about planting native plants around there. It'll keep the geese out for one. It's going to look nice. It's not maybe going to be as manicured in the way that we often think of it, but it can be beautiful depending on the plants that you put in. Create habitat for other native animals that are less likely to poop all over, like geese, right? Waterfowl and their poop are actually a huge contributor to the bacteria contamination that we get in the water. So talk to your HOA about planting native plants. If you go to the Zionsville Parks and Recreation YouTube channel, you will see another webinar that we did last week, the week before, in collaboration with a couple other agencies about how HOAs can create more native habitats and restore some of those areas. So as an individual, you have the power in your neighborhood to make some of these changes. If you don't live in an HOA, just do it on your own property then, right? Nobody there to stop you. And then contact your local lawmakers. A lot of times with environmental issues, the onus gets put on the individual, but really and truly, while we can make a lot of difference as individuals, a lot of the change has to come from the top in the form of regulation to make sure we keep and conserve areas and keep things healthy. Just last year, there was, some issues through the Indiana state legislature about wetlands, which act as a huge filter and buffer for keeping our waterways clean and healthy. And unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be easier for developers to destroy wetlands for development. And that's a huge loss for the health of our watersheds. So keeping in touch with your lawmakers, learn who represents you in your town, who represents you in your county, who represents you in a state, and who represents you federally. And whatever the issue is that comes up, talk to those individuals. They work for us. We have power in who we vote for. We have power in how we spend our money to try to help keep things healthy. So if these things are important to you, talk to these people who are making these laws and helping to regulate or deregulate things. So, all right, watersheds can improve. We've seen it happen. There are success stories. The Clean Water Act back in the 1970s was a huge stepping stone to keeping water clean and healthy and really important. We need more of it. We need more of that kind of stuff to help keep our watersheds nice and healthy so that we have clean water to drink, so that we have water that we can recreate in, so that maybe we could use some of these things as a food source eventually. And that so our native plants and animals have places that we can live. So here's two really simple success stories I want to talk about. The picture on the left is of Big Walnut Creek. Big Walnut Creek flows through western Boone and Hendricks County, on into Putnam County, and eventually goes into the Wabash. It's a beautiful body of water. That picture on the left is at McLeod Nature Park in Hendricks County. There was an issue back in the late 90s where some of the state researchers who from the Indiana Department of Environmental Management were seeing that some of the pollution levels of different things that they were measuring in Big Walnut Creek were way out of the range. They wanted to see them way, way, way too much. And it was from agricultural runoff. They knew because of what they were seeing that that's where the issue was coming from. So they spent several years in public education campaigns with local farmers on how they could improve practices that would keep the watershed healthy without sacrificing their yields, because that obviously is incredibly important to those farmers. And over the 7-year campaign, they saw Big Walnut Creek go from an impaired status to a healthy range, and it is now right where it ought to be most of the time, which is awesome. Huge local success story. Again, takes money, takes time, takes effort of lots of individuals, but very, very important. And then on the right, I love this picture. This is Mr. Trash Wheel. This is in Baltimore, Maryland, in Baltimore Harbor. So the trash wheel, so Baltimore is a highly urban area, and the water from the Baltimore Harbor exits out into the Chesapeake Bay, which empties into the Atlantic Ocean, okay? As this river that comes in and forms the Baltimore Harbor, the Jones Falls, comes in, that water has traveled all the way through the city before it empties out, and especially in heavy rain episodes, creates trash. So they installed this trash wheel, and they named it Mr. Trash Wheel. They put those two giant googly eyes on it. And what this does is it's sort of like a funnel system. As the trash comes through after a big rain event, it goes through this trash wheel, and the trash wheel is collecting all of the trash and then filtering out the water. And they've seen huge improvements in the Baltimore Harbor on the amount of litter that goes through. Now, this is not separating out chemicals, it's not separating out nutrients, unfortunately, but it's one step that has made a huge difference. Mr. Trash Wheel has a Twitter and a Facebook page. I don't know who manages the social media for it, but it's awesome. They post funny things they find. And the trash wheel design has been implemented in several other cities across the United States where they have this same problem. So there are things that we can do to help improve it. I would love to see something like this, maybe in the White River. It may not be the most appropriate spot for it because it doesn't empty out into a big, large body of water the same way the Jones Falls does in Baltimore, but it's really, really interesting. So I love that picture. I think it's fantastic. Mr. Trash Wheel. All right. As for the White River, the city of Indianapolis, Hamilton County have kind of partnered to envision what they see as the future of the White River. They want the White River to be a place that can create tourism opportunities, can be economically beneficial for recreation. And they realize, that a river is not just a resource for industry. It is a resource for tourism. People like to be along the water. They like those kinds of settings. they can create really awesome community features with it. So they've partnered together to, since the White River does flow right through much of Hamilton County and then on into Marion County through the city of Indianapolis, to come up with some long-term plans that they unveiled at the end of 2019. And so the picture on the left shows what they would imagine to see in, I believe this is Fishers, Noblesville or Fishers, but huge areas for swimming, water recreation, kayaks, canoes, things like that. They want to put a ropes course in. They want to have a rock climbing area and make it a nice big park that people could gather in. Further down into the city of Indianapolis, which is what you see on the right side, they would love to see places where there's wildlife corridors, there's meadows, maybe there's a beach, maybe there's you see this floating stage where maybe you could have performances, people could sit on the banks and watch a concert, people can come do all these things. And all of this is dependent on the river improving in its health, okay? I talked earlier about the fish kill that happened when the auto parts manufacturer in Anderson dumped a lot of harmful chemicals into the White River in '99. 20 years later, 20 plus years later, the fish numbers have improved, definitely improving. We are moving the right direction, but even the city of Indianapolis has admitted, swimming in the White River is not going to be advisable. Eating fish out of it is still not going to be advisable. We've got to do a lot more, and we're going to have to go upstream to try to find those solutions. It's not just the city of Indianapolis, it's everybody who is contributing to it. So us here in Zionsville, people out in Fishers and Noblesville, up in Muncie, really far away, are impacting what is happening in Indianapolis and beyond. And that's the interesting and fascinating thing to me about watersheds. It just highlights how interconnected we all are. I hope this all comes to fruition. I would love to see the White River as an incredible resource for the community. I think that would be awesome. And for wildlife, for the animals and plants that also call this place home. So if you want to dig in more, you want to learn a little bit more, I've got some resources here. The White River Alliance is an awesome organization. They schedule cleanups, they do research projects. You can volunteer in lots of different ways. They host a White River Festival, they do educational things. So their website's an awesome one to check out. And all these organizations that I'm going to put up also have social media pages. If you want to look them up on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever you do. White Rivers Alliance is a good one. Indiana Clear Choices Clean Water is an organization. Clear Choices Clean Water has divisions all across the country. And what they do is they try to highlight what are the issues in this area that individuals can help do. So on the Indiana Clear Choices Clean Water website, you'll see lots of different pledges you can take where there's educational things of how you can help improve the watershed, maybe through checking your septic system, taking care of your animal waste, not feeding the waterfowl, planting native plants, all the things to highlight of how you as an individual can help. So that's a really good one to check out. Indiana Clear Choices Clean Water website's right there. I talked earlier about the webinar that we just did a couple weeks ago about restoring HOA areas to native landscapes. You can go back and watch that. It's a really awesome one. There's lots of resources that you can then take to present to your HOA to try to get them on board with it. Some neighborhoods have already started doing this. They've seen that it's not just beneficial for the environment, but it has economical benefits. It has, benefits to the residents directly beyond just, oh, we're doing the right thing. The Indiana Department of Environmental Management, or IDEM, as its acronym is nicknamed, is another good one to check out. These guys are the organization in Indiana who go out and make sure people are doing the right thing with water and watersheds and, keeping things clean and stepping in if somebody's not. And they've got some good resources on their website. And then IUPUI Center for Earth and Environmental Studies Watershed Monitoring, that's a mouthful. But CEES, they do a lot of actually going out collecting the data, doing the research. They've got some really cool in-depth studies on that website that you see there that you can dig into if you're interested in learning more. So with that, I have taken up quite a bit of your time. It is almost 7 o'clock. So I'm going to stop there. If you are interested in learning more, or you have questions that I didn't answer, please feel free to put them into the comments and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you so much for jumping in. It was great to see everybody today. Take care.